The national debt is a serious problem, one that seems to be always with us and always getting worse. But the first thing I need to tell you about it is that you shouldn't get hysterical about it. The problem was worse at the end of World War II. What we need today are the kind of legislators that led us through World War II and out of the Great Depression. People who understood that they needed to know more about economics than a couple of slogans. Now, I'd like to take you back there. But first, we need to come to some agreement about just how large the national debt is. According to the Government Accounting Office, it's a little more than $12 trillion. But if you look on the internet, you'll usually see it at more than $17 trillion, or even $80 trillion, or $180 trillion. But what is it really? Well, the general fund of the U.S. Treasury is $17 trillion in debt. But $5 trillion of that is owed to the Social Security Fund. Now, if I was a businessman and I owned two businesses, and one of them was $17 trillion in debt, but owed 5 of that to my other business, I wouldn't say I was $17 trillion in debt. I'd say I was $12 trillion in debt. Now, you'll hear a lot of screeching on the internet about how the government has raided Social Security and left behind a lot of worthless IOUs. Well, that's been said so loudly that it may have affected you, but listen to what it was really about. Over the years, we've paid $5 trillion more into Social Security than we've taken out. So the managers of the Social Security Fund have to do something with that money, and they have bought U.S. government bonds. Now, the world over, U.S. government bonds are regarded as the safest investment there is. That's why they can pay less interest than any other investment you can make. So the managers of the Social Security Fund have done just what they should. They have invested that money very safely and securely, and that haven't left behind a lot of worthless IOUs. Now, what about the $80 trillion of debt? People who claim that's the debt want to include in the debt every obligation the United States has far into the future, including all the Social Security benefits that it will pay to anybody who's alive today. Now, that's like saying, I'm going to buy a car in 10 years, and I intend to pay for it out of the money I earn in 10 years, but I'd better include the price of that car in my current debt. Well, that's absurd. Now, they do say something that's right. They say that the government doesn't fund Social Security the way a corporation would have to fund its pension fund. Well, the history of it is like this. Social Security was started at the end of the Great Depression, a time when many elderly Americans had not been able to save any money for their retirement, and they were in desperate poverty. So a deal was struck. The current generation of working Americans would fund the elderly a small pension. And when they themselves became elderly, the next generation of working Americans would fund a small pension for them. That's how it's worked and continues to work. But a corporation can't do the same thing. If you were looking for a job at a corporation and they said, well, we'll give you a pension in 30 years and we'll pay for it out of the money we're making in 30 years, you would say, well, you may not be here in 30 years. Our government is more stable than a corporation, even when it's infested with lunatics who say that if they don't get their way about everything, they're going to shut down the government and welch on the national debt. It's still more secure than a corporation. So the national debt is just what the accountants at the GAOs say it is. It's a little more than $12 trillion, which is too much because it means that 7% of our taxes are spent just servicing the national debt. Now, there's more to it than just the size of the national debt. If we had only $1 billion national debt, it would mean nothing to us. But to a small country with a small economy, it might crush their economy. The amount of debt you can have depends on how big your economy is. Now, I'll refer to the relationship between the national debt and the size of our economy as the debt ratio. Now, at the end of World War II, the debt ratio was larger than it is today. But every administration, Republican or Democrat, after World War II, reduced the debt ratio until the Nixon-Ford administration. Dwight Eisenhower reduced it while building the interstate highway system. Democrats reduced it while starting Social Security and Medicare. We even reduced the debt ratio during the Vietnam War. But during the Nixon-Ford administration, a lot of Republicans got the idea that if you reduced the tax rate, the economy would expand so fast that tax revenues would actually increase. Well, it hasn't worked once in 50 years. And every Republican administration since Nixon Ford has produced a dramatic increase in the debt ratio. And every Democratic administration has reduced it, except for the current one. But give them credit, they have stabilized it, and it is now going down. And look at the mess they were handed and how much cooperation they've had. When Republicans send up all this fireworks about the national debt, don't look at that. It's just a distraction. Look at what they've done when they are in power. They don't give a tinker's damn about the national debt. And they think of a political campaign as having all the moral imperatives of a Coca-Cola commercial. All that matters is sales. Truth and justice? That's for weak-kneed liberals. Well, I'll admit that I've known Democrats to lie. But Democrats have been responsible about the national debt, even when it's cost them their favorite policies. And Republicans have not. So what do we do about all this Republican debt? Well, sometimes the government spends money that it shouldn't spend. So we could look in the budget for causes of the debt. Well, we can't look at places like welfare because all the welfare programs put together are less than 2% of the national budget. We'd need to look at the big hog at the trough, the military. And frankly, I don't see why we should have to spend almost as much money on the military as every other country in the world put together. But even all that military spending is not responsible for the national debt. Government spending is not responsible for the national debt, and here's why. Since 1970, the ratio of government spending to the size of the economy has gone dramatically downward. You can see that. Since 1970, if you don't count people hired by the government in response to 9/11, since 1970, the number of government employees has grown by less than 1%, while the population has doubled. Even if you include the TSA employees hired after 9/11, the number of government employees has only increased by 30%, while the population has doubled. Government has been shrinking and is not responsible for the national debt. So what is the policy responsible for? Well, it's the tax policy changes that are responsible. If you were to look at a modern version of those 1950s and 60s tax policies, we would only be taxing at a very high rate that part of your income greater than $1 million a year. Now, you don't have to feel sorry for people who have multi-million-dollar incomes. Their first $1 million after taxes would provide them with pocket money of $2,000 a day. For another comparison, Japan has the second largest economy of a developed country. Their 100 largest corporations pay their CEOs typically $1 million a year. There's no reason why the CEOs of our 100 largest corporations should earn 10 times as much and hardly be taxed on it. So this is just one reason for going back to those 1950s and 60s Republican tax policies. There are even more compelling reasons, and you can learn about them by listening to my talk on economic inequality that I give to Tea Party groups. If you haven't done that, I'd like you to do it now. But thanks for listening to this.